Amid the burning oil wells of Kuwait, two armies faced each other on the edge of battle. At stake, the oil fields of the Middle East. It was a war whose weaponry would give a glimpse of how men will fight in the 21st century. A war which would allow America to banish the ghosts of Vietnam and rediscover confidence in its military might. A war which would curb an aggressive dictator with nuclear ambitions. And a war which would do much to shape the world we live in. This is its story. Eight weeks before plunging the Middle East into war, Saddam Hussein welcomed his neighbor, the Emir of Kuwait. The Emir ruled one of the richest countries on earth. Kuwait had less than 1 million citizens, but 1/10 of the world's oil. Saddam was a dictator with ambitions. For 8 years, he fought Iran. Now, 2 years on, he was using Iraq's huge oil revenues to develop nuclear weapons and equip a 1 million-strong army. He wanted to challenge Israel and dominate the Middle East. But the British and American governments thought he was a dictator they could do business with.
We had thought this man has fought a war against Iran for 8 years. During those 8 years, something like 500,000 young people have been killed. 500,000 on both sides. Surely after that, he can't go and have another military operation.
The idea that on a Sunday afternoon or something, I was going to stroll into the Oval and go, oh, by the way, Mr. President, Saddam Hussein is going to mass 100,000 plus forces and is going to walk into Kuwait and is going to make this the 19th province of Iraq. And this is going to be the major test of the post-Cold War world. That was too big. It was too dramatic.
But that day in May 1990, Saddam was fighting to survive. His military ambitions meant Iraq was living beyond its means. The price of oil was plummeting. The country would be bankrupt in 3 months. Saddam blamed the Emir. The Emir was flooding the market with cheap oil. Cheap oil meant bigger profits for the thousands of companies Kuwait owned in the West. Later, when the day's business was over, Saddam summoned the Arab leaders to a private meeting. When the cameras left, he warned the Emir to stop pushing down the price of oil.
He said each dollar less in price means to us 1 billion in revenues for a year. If you do not mean waging a war against Iraq, please stop it.
As economic collapse approached, Saddam used vast rallies to whip up opinion against Kuwait. But the Emir took a tough stand. Saddam and his inner circle scented a conspiracy to crush their regime before they could challenge Israel.
By the end of June, we started to realize that there is a conspiracy against Iraq, a deliberate conspiracy against Iraq by Kuwait, organized, devised by the United States.
Saddam summoned the key men in his regime. They decided unless Kuwait handed over $10 billion immediately, Iraq would invade. Saddam ordered the Republican Guard to move south towards Iraq's border with Kuwait. These were the Iraqi army's elite divisions. Equipped with modern Soviet tanks, no other Middle Eastern country except Israel had forces to rival them. Soon, on the border between Iraq and Kuwait, 30,000 Iraqi troops had massed. A traveling British diplomat saw them and told American military intelligence.
Our first indication came from a human intelligence source, a very reliable one, who identified 3 Republican Guard divisions moving south toward Kuwait.
In Washington, America's most senior soldier was soon inspecting pictures from a spy satellite and trying to piece together the Iraqi plan.
Over the next few days, over a relatively short period of time, more and more information came forward that started to put these pieces in place. Artillery was coming forward. Logistics units were being seen. Signals networks were coming up, to the point that finally it could not be ignored, and I called General Schwarzkopf and said, "Norm, are you looking at what I'm looking at?" And he says, "Yes."
It was only when we started to see this pattern of the type of forces that you would need to conduct an operation being grouped together geographically on the ground that it became very apparent that what you were seeing emerging was a military plan.
The news was passed to George Bush, then in his second year as president. Satellite pictures couldn't tell him what Saddam intended, but the president and his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, knew vital interests were at stake.
The notion of Iraq, which was an oil powerhouse in itself, acquiring the Kuwaiti resources, and thus perhaps being able to dominate OPEC, was a tremendous danger.
Help was at hand. With the crisis building, one of America's closest allies in the Middle East had rushed to Baghdad. Once again, the band played and the red carpet was rolled out. The president of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, had been sent by the Arab world to discover Saddam's plans. It was an encounter that would have far-reaching consequences.
I met with Saddam Hussein. He met me in the airport. Then he took me in the car. He was driving, inside him, nobody with us, until we went to one of the palaces near the lake there. And we went upstairs to the first floor, tete-a-tete, in a big room, and we were both alone, nobody with us. I asked him about what's the problem, what's happening. I told him, do you have any intention to attack them, invade them? He told me, no, but don't tell the Kuwaitis about that. It was a very clear answer.
As soon as he left Iraq, the Egyptian president telephoned the White House with the news that Saddam was bluffing. Mubarak told George Bush that the Iraqi leader was desperate for money, but the Arabs could sort things out. President Mubarak flew on to Kuwait. The emir was desperate for news. As soon as the two leaders were alone, the emir began to describe the pressure he was under.
He told me that Saddam Hussein asked me to give him $10 billion cash. He told me I cannot bring 10 billion cash now. Anyway, I told him what happened between me and Saddam. In the evening, I told him there is no intention to attack Kuwait, as Saddam said. But he told me, don't tell him. But I told him because they were terrified.
When we made general offers to the Kuwaitis of military support, their response was, stay away from us. We can handle this. We can handle this together with our Arab brothers. The most we'll have to deal with is problems at the Arab League. We'll negotiate this. Don't take actions that will provoke the Iraqis to do what we fear they might do.
The 30,000 troops on Kuwait's border became 100,000, but nothing was done. For 7 days, Arab leaders insisted this was bluff. In London and Washington, politicians used to doing business with Saddam gave him the benefit of the doubt. In Saudi Arabia, on August the 1st, the Iraqis walked out of talks. Saddam issued his orders.
من جمعونا بالليلة نفسها بالليل نريد نتحرك بها الكويت جمعونا الساعة 4 العصر.
We gathered at 4 o'clock on the afternoon before the invasion.
أسماء مناطق الكويت على المنضدة. وبعدين هم كانوا
On a map table we were shown our objectives in Kuwait.
آمر فوجنا. بعدين من
Our captain explained the Kuwaiti government was about to change. We'd been asked to help set up the new government.
الحكومة الكويتية راح تتغير وطالبين نعاون الحكومة الكويتية لترتيب الحكومة الجديدة.
Now in exile, at that time General Wafiq al-Samurai met Saddam almost daily. He remembers Saddam double-checking his calculations.
Saddam thought any reprisals would be limited and would tail off with time. He believed that America's involvement in Vietnam had destroyed its willingness to use military power. Vietnam had been an outright defeat.
As they spoke, a satellite took this photograph. American intelligence analysts searched for the bases which had been crammed with hundreds of Iraqi tanks. But when they found them, the bases were empty. Tank tracks led towards Kuwait. The Pentagon went to its highest alert level.
We issued WatchCon 1. It was the first time the DIA, since the system was established, had gone to WatchCon 1 because we wanted to make it very clear that this was a different condition. The buildup was complete. We would receive no more warning, but the invasion was imminent.
I was essentially deputized to go back to the White House to meet with Scowcroft and the president and to convince them to take one last shot at trying to influence Saddam. And just as we were talking about what exactly he would say to Saddam in this last effort to get him to think twice before doing anything, that's when the phone rang saying, "We just heard from our people in Kuwait, shooting has started, this war, whatever it is, has begun."
Republican Guard tanks started to seal off the city. Special forces were landed by helicopter on the beaches. They advanced to seize key government buildings. The emir had stood down his army to avoid provoking Saddam. Many Kuwaiti officers were abroad on their summer holidays.
I received a call from a friend in the foreign ministry, and he told me that the foreign minister said that now, and stressed now, is the time for the U.S. to act. And I said to him, there may have been a time to act yesterday, there may be a time to act in the future, but I don't know what we can do right now.
A few Kuwaiti units mounted a hasty defense of the emir and his palace, but Iraqi tanks soon overwhelmed them. The emir was driven away with minutes to spare. The emir and his bodyguard made for Saudi Arabia, mingling with confused rush hour traffic. Iraqi intelligence had expected the emir's capture and already anticipated how he would be dealt with.
القسم الآخر من السموم هو الثاليوم.
Thallium is a poison that has a very strong impact on the nervous system. It leads to death within 1 month of administration. It's what has happened many times to opposition figures.
وحصلت هكذا حالات كثيرة تجاه المعارضة.
By noon, Saddam Hussein controlled 1/5 of the world's oil.
For us it was shocking, shocking. I couldn't believe that this could happen in the Arab world. Saddam Hussein, we were very in good terms and he was a friend, we know each other very well, but didn't expect him to do that.
Saddam probably figured the Arab world and the world at large would bitch and moan for a couple of days, and then people would get used to it. And the world would essentially learn to live with it. And the United States, which had left Lebanon a decade before and so forth, was not going to do anything, and even if the United States wanted to do something, the local Arabs would never do anything. They would never work with the United States and stand up to Saddam. So I think Saddam took the pretty intelligent decision that he could probably get away with it.
Well, we really needed some time to come to grips with this basic fundamental question of our strategic assessment of what this meant. Did it matter that he'd taken Kuwait?
To put it bluntly, what we ultimately did, sending 500,000 people around the world and all that entailed, that was too big of a thought for people at that first meeting even to think about. So instead, you had people talking all over the place, many of whom were talking about how we could live with this.
The president left to give a speech in Aspen, Colorado. Brent Scowcroft traveled with him.
The president was way out in front of most of his advisors. He felt the same way I did about it, about the sort of resigned tone of the meeting, and that there was no sense of outrage or no sense of imperative.
But now Saddam Hussein had his first stroke of bad luck. Another leader was also in Aspen.
George Bush just said to me, Margaret, what is your view? And so indeed I told him that aggressors must be stopped. Not only stopped, but they must be thrown out. An aggressor cannot gain from his aggression. He must be thrown out, and really, by that time in my mind, I thought we ought to throw him out so decisively that he could never think of doing it again.
The president said little to the press, but he was already inclining towards action. Margaret Thatcher remembers telling him Saddam Hussein was a potential Hitler who had to be stopped. It was talk that steeled the president's determination. The president returned to Washington. He led a country for whom the last war was not the war with Hitler, but the quagmire of Vietnam. Nevertheless, at the White House and later at Camp David, the president and his advisors now met to take the first steps towards war. The CIA director began with an electrifying warning.
Over 100,000 Iraqi troops had found their way south of Kuwait City, indicating yet another intention beyond the invasion of Kuwait, either to terrorize Saudi Arabia or to actually invade it.
Well, one of the first questions was, is he going to stop at the borders of Kuwait? Saddam, is he going to stop there? Or is he likely to go on into Saudi Arabia and move down to the oil fields?
We had no idea what he was going to do. Everybody'd been dead wrong with respect to the question of whether or not he was going to invade Kuwait, and he'd invaded Kuwait, and he had 140,000 Iraqi troops on the Saudi border. The key decision that came out of that meeting is, we will defend Saudi Arabia. There was no debate about that. The question I then posed is, then what? Are we prepared, should we be prepared to go forward and fight for Kuwait?
The president made no response. Vietnam had shaped Colin Powell. Powell feared the military was again in danger of being trapped in an unpopular war in a faraway place.
For those of us who were Vietnam veterans, we all have a view that says, if you're going to put us into something, then you owe the armed forces, you owe the American people a clear statement of what political objective you're trying to achieve.
While Colin Powell left for Washington to organize troops to defend Saudi Arabia, Brent Scowcroft stayed at Camp David with the president to persuade the Saudis to accept the troops. The next afternoon, the president returned to the White House. The general still hoped talk of liberating Kuwait had gone away, leaving America committed only to the defense of Saudi Arabia.
He motioned me to come out, so I went out there, and he said, what's going on, what have we heard? And what I essentially reported was that there had been zero progress.
This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait.
On live television, the generals watched the president commit the United States to liberating Kuwait.
I've got to go. I have to go to work. I got to go to work.
I liked it. I liked it very much. Others Colin Powell says, that'll teach us to leave you up at Camp David alone with him.
Satellites now showed 2 Iraqi divisions on the Saudi border. The CIA reported the Saudis were considering buying Saddam off. If the Iraqis attacked Saudi Arabia's ports, Saddam would control yet another fifth of the world's oil.
I asked the Saudi ambassador to come in, and he said that the Saudis weren't at all sure they wanted to be helped by the United States. And he cited a couple of examples where the United States had offered help and then demonstrated enormous weakness. And he said, frankly, we're afraid you say you'll help and then the going will get tough and you'll pull out and we'll be left.
The president dispatched his defense secretary to Saudi Arabia. Dick Cheney and his high-level delegation had to convince Saudi Arabia's rulers it might soon be another Kuwait. They met with the king.
I told King Fahd that they did not have the luxury of waiting until Saddam began an invasion of Saudi Arabia and then asked for our help, because then it would be too late.
When Norm Schwarzkopf started laying out what we were prepared to send to Saudi Arabia, beginning with 200,000 troops, I just had the sense that Fahd was absolutely stunned.
At the end of that discussion, the king turned and said, okay. And I almost fell out of my chair because I absolutely was sitting there thinking, well, you know, this is going to be, thank you very much for the information, we'll let you know. And the king said, okay. And I think we all did a double take and went back and said, you know, Secretary Cheney said, so you agree? And the king said, yes, I agree. We walked out of the meeting and I said to Secretary Cheney, I said, sir, I'm prepared to start the flow now. Do you want me to do that? And Secretary Cheney said, yes. And so I turned to Chuck and I said, Chuck, send them on their way.
The largest single movement of troops since World War II began. The president emphasized it was to defend Saudi Arabia, not to liberate Kuwait. The first American aircraft refueled above the Saudi desert. Saddam Hussein had never expected to see forces from America, the great ally of Israel, operating from Arab soil. But the invasion had turned both Western and Arab governments against Iraq. Soon, British, French, and Egyptian troops arrived, the beginnings of a coalition of 30 countries. Iraq's intelligence chief warned if war began, Iraq would lose. Saddam was furious.
None of us dared say withdraw from Kuwait. None of us. Saddam said, you're acting as if you're salesmen for Western arms and technology. If it's God's will, victory will be ours.
Saddam rounded up foreigners in Kuwait as hostages. He hoped to intimidate the British and American publics. But his encounter with 7-year-old Stuart Lockwood served only to inflame them.
Does Stuart get his milk?
Yes, he does.
Saddam ruled Kuwait, as he'd always ruled Iraq, with terror. The UN imposed sanctions and called on Saddam to withdraw. Instead, he sent 250,000 soldiers into Kuwait. Kuwait's wealth was systematically plundered. At one hospital, premature babies were left to die as soldiers looted incubators for Iraqi hospitals. Some Kuwaitis tried to fight back. But after the car bombs came reprisals.
They started killing Iraqi soldiers, kidnapping them and killing them. Saddam gave an order to attack any area from which a single shot was fired, so that's what we did.
The fledgling resistance movement was soon broken. The methods used allowed Bush to elevate the struggle into a moral crusade.
Summary executions, routine torture, Hitler revisited. America will not stand aside. The world will not allow the strong to swallow up the weak.
Saddam Hussein paid his first visit to Kuwait. George Bush had authorized the CIA to start recruiting Iraqi dissidents to overthrow him. America's equivalent of the SAS, Delta Force, was on standby to go into Iraq and kidnap him. But Saddam's security was too good. President Bush moved closer to war. He met Mikhail Gorbachev to ask the Soviet Union not to stand in the way if America went to war with Iraq. Iraq was an old ally of the Soviet Union, but Gorbachev agreed. The Cold War had just ended. Gorbachev did not want to risk his relationship with America.
Very good. Thank you.
This was a key meeting. A country had been occupied. If at that point in history we had not been able to deal with that situation, everything else we had worked for would have been null and void.
Without the Soviet Union on board, we never would have been able to marshal the international coalition that we were able to build up. It just gave a completely different dynamic to the whole effort. Instead of being an effort, let's say, by the United States and the United Kingdom to eject Iraq from Kuwait, it was an effort by the entire international community.
But Gorbachev wasn't willing to write a blank check. He added an important proviso.
We agreed with all the Security Council resolutions. We would do everything possible to force Iraq to accept them. We did not rule out the use of military force as a final resort, but all of us must search for a political settlement to avoid war.
This is U.S. Navy warship, Channel 14. Can you tell us what country your flag does under?
The need to bind the Soviets into the coalition dominated American tactics during the first flashpoint. 2 Iraqi tankers tried to sneak past 50 warships from 12 countries enforcing United Nations sanctions. At the President's holiday home in Maine, a crisis meeting. From London, Mrs. Thatcher argued the tankers should be sunk, but the President sided with the Soviet request to backpedal.
The President decided that we would let the ships go, and so he called Prime Minister Thatcher to tell her that, and she says, "Well, George, all right, I'll accede to this one, but this is no time to go wobbly."
A week later, King Hussein of Jordan came to seek British support for a face-saving deal for Saddam. The king was an old ally of the West, but he was also close to Saddam. He feared a war would engulf Jordan. Mrs. Thatcher was implacable.
The meeting started with my speaking to her of my views and my attempts and my frustrations, and then she was very quiet for a long period of time, and then she gave me her responses.
He walked into a firestorm. She flew at him. She said that she thought he had calculated entirely wrongly. He had made the wrong decision by encouraging Iraq, by appearing to support Iraq. She gave him the toughest time I think he's ever had in his life.
I had to ask a question. Was it conceivable that you could ever be wrong?
Look, I was not discourteous. I was firm, very firm indeed.
But in Washington, there was division. The CIA, like British intelligence, reported sanctions might take 5 years to liberate Kuwait. The president began to see war as inevitable. But America's top general had grave misgivings. Colin Powell went to the White House to explain how long-term sanctions might work.
I laid out for him what a sanctions policy might look like and how it would work. He listened intently in that way he has, somewhat slouched in his chair with his chin slightly down. And his response was, well, Colin, that's all very, very interesting. It's good to consider all options, but I just don't think we're going to have time for sanctions to work.
But even after this meeting, Colin Powell would continue to argue against his president's line. 2 weeks later, in the Pentagon, Powell spoke with a top British commander.
Colin Powell said to me that he would be prepared to give sanctions a considerable time to work. And I said, well, how long are we talking about? To my astonishment, Colin Powell said, well, I would give them up to 2 years to work. He said, I don't think we should mount a military operation for at least that length of time, if that's what it takes for the sanctions to work, which he was confident that they would, because he felt there was a real risk of perhaps winning the war, but losing the peace in the Middle East.
The president and his generals were on a collision course. In the desert, under appalling conditions, were troops from America, Britain, France, and the Arab coalition. They couldn't stay indefinitely. The president feared his coalition might collapse before Saddam's determination buckled. He told the generals to brief him on how they would take back Kuwait. It was an order that infuriated Norman Schwarzkopf. The troops he commanded had been sent to defend Saudi Arabia.
Everybody's saving lots of money right now, sir. No kidding.
Schwarzkopf believed there weren't enough of them to storm Kuwait's defenses and defeat an army of occupation which outnumbered them 2 to 1. He feared Bush's impatience might lead to military disaster.
They're great, aren't they? Colin called me and said, I want you to send an offensive option back. And I objected strongly. I said, look, I've told everybody all along we do not have the forces on the ground to conduct an offensive option.
My view was, well, that's all right, you know, it's a work in progress. Bring it back to the United States. Let us brief it, and we'll all see where we are.
Only 3 days later, Schwarzkopf's chief planner, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Purvis, was sent to brief the president and his aides. To Purvis, it was obvious the best option was to outflank the Iraqi defenses. But he and Schwarzkopf believed there were only enough troops to attack head-on. The computers predicted 10,000 casualties.
My first question is, why don't you go around to the west? And the answer was, well, we don't have enough gas trucks. We'll run out of gas when we're up there on the shoulder. We can't do that. It's not a feasible option. And maybe something, we don't know what kind of sand there is or something. But I was pretty appalled.
The military were saying, here's the way we'd have to do it in a manner that would suggest extraordinary number of casualties and a large price to pay.
This was an effort, however conscious or unconscious, to basically say, this is going to be a near-run thing, and the casualties are going to be very high, and maybe we ought not do this. I think that there was very little enthusiasm in the American military for, in fact, throwing Saddam out of Kuwait militarily.
I wasn't trying to frighten them. I wanted to make sure they understood the significance of the operation we were thinking about. This wasn't going to be just a simple walk in the woods, drop a few bombs, and they'll all go home the way the Egyptians and the Saudis and the Turks were telling my political colleagues. And these were all gentlemen who had never really been in a major war. And so what I was trying to do is make sure they understood what we were doing and the difficulties of what we were doing, especially when it came to a ground plan. And I think the ground plan is what scared them all to death.
That night there was a crisis of confidence at the heart of the administration. The politicians wondered if the right generals were in command. Colin Powell rushed to Saudi Arabia to meet Schwarzkopf. They knew that back in Washington, Dick Cheney was forming his own team to plan an offensive in case they dragged their feet. Schwarzkopf laid out what he believed was needed if the president wanted war. He asked Powell to support him.
When Colin came over for his briefing, I pointed out all of my trepidations And the conclusion of that was Colin said, okay, if you are going to be required to attack, you will have the forces that you need. That was very reassuring to me.
Colin Powell returned to the White House.
So, Mr. President, if you direct us to attack in order to eject the Iraqi army out of Kuwait, this is how we're going to do it.
They asked for the 7th Corps, the 2 heaviest divisions in the American Army out of Europe, which totally weakened NATO. They asked for 6 carrier battle groups. And then the political poison pill, they asked for the activation of the National Guard and the Army Reserves. The force represented in these 3 requests was just awesome, overwhelming, not to mention the cost. The President pushed his chair back, said, you've got it, and if you need more, come see me.
I left that meeting after that with a firm decision, no question about it, that sanctions had about 3 months left to produce a result. And if they did not produce a result in 3 months, we were going to war.
I have today directed the Secretary of Defense to increase the size of U.S. forces committed to Desert Shield to ensure that the coalition has an adequate offensive military option should that be necessary to achieve our common goals.
The American army that would have fought World War III against the Soviet Union was on the move. 250,000 American troops headed for the Gulf. Britain sent a further 20,000. Margaret Thatcher's last act as Prime Minister. Bush had dragged his reluctant generals to the brink of war. He had assembled international support. Now, he had to convince the American public and the Congress. Bush's political opponents in the Congress began to sense public opinion would not stand for war.
There was very little public support in the United States for the idea of going to war in the Persian Gulf.
Some people never get the word. The fight isn't about oil. The fight is about naked aggression that will not stand.
If we were going to fight a war, we had to do so with the support of the American people. If possible, with the support of the American Congress. But that if we were going to send people, Americans, off to die in the Persian Gulf, we had to be able to survive the judgments of history, that we didn't do so precipitously.
The United Nations gave Iraq 6 weeks to withdraw. After that, coalition forces would go to war. In America, opposition on the streets and in Congress intensified. It looked like Vietnam all over again. The morning after the UN decision, the President risked an about-face to win the political battle.
To go the extra mile for peace, I will issue an invitation to Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz to come to Washington. I'm asking Secretary Jim Baker to go to Baghdad to see Saddam Hussein.
The President had not consulted his allies. They were furious.
It seemed to be entirely the wrong signal. It seemed it would sort of give the Iraqis the impression that it could all be negotiated, that anything was possible, there was no need to withdraw.
Just 6 days before the UN deadline for war, and after many changes of plan, James Baker prepared to meet Tariq Aziz. The Americans needed the talks to win over public opinion and a hostile Congress. But they feared the Iraqis might offer a deal that would split the coalition.
If there is a genuine, sincere, serious intention to make peace in the whole region of the Middle East, we are ready to reciprocate. When I went to meet with James Baker, I hadn't the slightest idea that that meeting would succeed. I knew that that was public relations, that he wanted to tell the Congress, look, to the end I tried to find a diplomatic settlement so that he could get few more votes.
Baker carried a letter from President Bush to the Iraqi leader demanding withdrawal and reminding Saddam that America had nuclear weapons.
Thank you, everyone. The president's letter to Saddam Hussein, which Tariq Aziz read in Geneva, made it very clear that if Iraq used weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, against United States forces, that the American people would demand vengeance, and that we had the means to achieve it.
I read it very carefully. And then when I ended reading it, I told him, look, Mr. Secretary, this is not the kind of correspondence between two heads of state. This is a letter of threat, and I cannot receive from you a letter of threat to my president, and I returned it to him.
In Washington, the president and his team could only wait.
We basically said, what if Saddam proposes this? What if he proposes a partial pullback? What if he actually does a partial pullback and promises a complete pullback? What we did was we must have gamed out 10 different Iraqi scenarios that we thought would test the coalition.
And I could never figure out why he didn't do it. He could have just given us fits. And that was what I was worried about happening as a result of a meeting like this.
But in Geneva, Tariq Aziz offered no last-minute compromise. Instead, the talk had turned to war.
I said that they should not make the mistake of assuming that they would control the terms of the battle, as perhaps they might have assumed in their war with Iran, that this would be a totally different situation, that our technological superiority was overwhelming and would be brought to bear.
My response was very cool. I told him, Mr. Secretary, Iraq is a very ancient nation. We have lived for 6,000 years. I have no doubts that you are a very powerful nation. I have no doubts that you have a very strong military machine, and you will inflict on us heavy losses, but Iraq will survive. And this leadership will decide the future of Iraq.
And I was certain at the time that we would be going to war, and going to war very, very soon.
The talks had lasted over 6 hours. Across the world, people waited expectantly to hear if there would be peace or war.
Regrettably, ladies and gentlemen, in over 6 hours, I heard nothing that suggested to me any Iraqi flexibility whatsoever.
Even to this day, I am stunned by Saddam's failure to exploit all of his options. Time and time again, Saddam, by opting for the maximum, actually made it relatively, I hate to use the word easy, but made it much less difficult on the United States and the coalition to sustain itself. And, you know, I'm not sure at times so much whether we won it, but clearly he lost it.
Now, Congress began to debate whether to give authority for war, something they'd never done over Vietnam. No one knew how the vote would go. For 3 days, they debated. Everything hung in the balance. If Bush lost but tried to go to war, he risked impeachment.
On this vote, the yeas are 52, and the nays are 47.
We would not have won the vote without Geneva. We simply wouldn't. In the aftermath of the Geneva meeting, opposition to our use of force eroded. So it was an idea that germinated with the president. It was the right idea. We did it right, and there really should be no second thoughts about that. It worked exactly the way it should have worked.
President Bush had taken America and its allies to the eve of war. The war would be fought to stop Saddam keeping control of 20% of the world's oil. But Bush also believed this would be a just war against a dangerous dictator.
The president, privately, with the most inner circle, made absolutely clear he was going to go forward with this action, even if he were impeached. The truth of the matter is that while public opinion and the voice of Congress was important to Bush, I believe it had no impact on his decision about what he would do. He was going to throw that son of a bitch out of Kuwait regardless of whether the Congress or the public supported him.
7 days after the Geneva peace talks, stealth bombers left for Baghdad. The Gulf War was about to begin.